Please be seated. Proceedings are resumed. And we took the suspension. The Honorable the Deputy Leader of the Opposition was contributing to the defense bill. Honorable Leader of the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when we took the break, I was about to seek your permission to read briefly from an article that I got from the BBC website. I have a copy here for you if you would prefer to look at it first. So, Speaker, the article is titled, "Why the Indian Soldiers of World War I Were Forgotten," written on the 2nd of July 2015. And I'll read this to provide some context for some of the concerns that I have. Exactly 100 years after the guns of August boomed across the European continent, the world had been extensively commemorating the seminal event. The Great War, as it was called then, was described at the time as the war to end all wars. Ironically, the eruption of an even more destructive conflict 20 years after the end of this one meant that it is now known as the First World War. Those who fought and died in the First World War would have had little idea that there would soon be a second. But while the war took the flower of Europe's youth to its premature grave, snuffing out the lives of a generation of talented poets, artists, cricketers, and others whose genius bled into the trenches, it also involved soldiers from faraway lands that had little to do with Europe's bitter traditional hatreds. The role and sacrifices of Australians, New Zealanders, Canadians, and South Africans had been celebrated for some time in books and novels, and even rendered immortal on celluloid in award-winning films like Gallipoli. Of the 1.3 million Indian troops who served in the conflict, however, you hear very little. As many as 74,187 Indian soldiers died during the war, and a comparable number were wounded. Their stories and their heroism have long been omitted from popular histories of the war, or relegated to the footnotes. India contributed a number of divisions and brigades to the European, Mediterranean, Mesopotamian, North Africa, and East Africa theaters of war. In Europe, Indian soldiers were among the first victims who suffered the horrors of the trenches. They were killed in droves before the war was into its second year and bore the brunt of many a German offensive. It was Indian Jawans, junior soldiers, who stopped the German advance at Ypres in the autumn of 1914, soon after the war broke out, while the British were still recruiting and training their own forces. Hundreds were killed in a gallant but futile engagement at Neuve Chapelle. More than 1,000 of them died in Gallipoli, thanks to Churchill's folly. Nearly 700,000 Indian sepoys, or infantry privates, fought in Mesopotamia against the Ottoman Empire, Germany's ally, many of them Indian Muslims, taking up arms against their co-religionists in defense of the British Empire. The most painful experiences were those of soldiers fighting in the trenches of Europe. Letters sent by Indian soldiers in France and Belgium to their family members in their villages back home speak an evocative language of cultural dislocation and tragedy. "The shells are pouring like rain in the monsoon," declared one. "The corpses cover the country like sheaves of harvested corn," wrote another. These men were undoubtedly heroes, pitchforked into battle in unfamiliar lands, in harsh and cold climatic conditions they were neither used to nor prepared for, fighting an enemy of whom they had no knowledge, risking their lives every day for little more than pride. Yet they were destined to remain largely unknown once the war was over, neglected by the British, for whom they fought, and ignored by their own country, from which they came. Part of the reason is that they were not fighting for their own country. None of the soldiers was a conscript. Soldiering was their profession. They served the very British Empire that was oppressing their own people back home. The British raised men and money from India, as well as large supplies of food, cash, and ammunition, collected both by British taxation of Indians and from the nominally autonomous princely states. In return, the British had insincerely promised to deliver progressive self-rule to India at the end of the war. Perhaps had they kept that pledge, the sacrifices of India's First World War soldiers might have been seen in their homeland as a contribution to India's freedom. But the British broke their word. Mahatma Gandhi, who returned to his homeland for good from South Africa in January 1915, supported the war, as he had supported the British in the Boer War. The great Nobel Prize-winning poet Tagore was somewhat more sardonic about nationalism. We, the famished, ragged ragamuffins of the East, are to win freedom for all humanity, he wrote during the war. We have no word for nation in our language. India was racked by high taxation to support the war and the high inflation accompanying it. While this disruption of trade caused by the conflict led to widespread economic losses, all this while the country was also reeling from a raging influenza epidemic that took many lives. But nationalists widely understood from British statements that at the end of the war, India would receive the dominion status hitherto reserved for the white Commonwealth. It was not to be. When the war ended in triumph for Britain, India was denied its promised reward. Instead of self-government, the British imposed the repressive Rowlatt Act, which vested the Viceroy's government with extraordinary powers to quell sedition against the empire by silencing and censoring the press, detaining political activists without trial, and arresting without a warrant any individuals suspected of treason against the empire. Public protest against this draconian legislation was quelled ruthlessly. The worst incident was the Bag massacre of April 1919, when Brigadier General Reginald Dyer ordered his troops to fire without warning on 15,000 unarmed and non-violent men and women, and children demonstrating peacefully in an enclosed garden in Amritsar, killing as many as 1,499 and wounding up to 1,137. The fact that Dyer was hailed as a hero by the British, who raised a handsome purse to reward him for his deed, marked the final rupture between British imperialism and his Indian subjects. Sir Tagore returned his knighthood to the British in protest against the helplessness of our position as British subjects in India. He did not want a badge of honor in the congruous context of humiliation. With British providing such a sour ending to the narrative of a war in which India had given its all and had been spurned in return, Indian nationalists felt that the country had nothing to thank its soldiers for. They had merely gone abroad to serve their foreign masters. Losing your life or limb in a foreign war, fought at the behest of your colonial rulers, was an occupational hazard. It did not qualify to be hailed as a form of national service. Mr. Speaker, I read that because I wanted to underscore how horribly wrong things can go when you don't start off on the right footing. We're living in very uncertain times. The notion that any of our regiment may be engaged in a conflict is remote, I agree. But we don't know what the future holds. We don't know where we're going to go from here. If you listen to all the predictions of what is to come in this world, it is quite scary at times. But again, none of us knows where we're headed. And I'm concerned about a lot of the provisions in this bill, Mr. Speaker, that bear eerie similarities to what unfolded with the Indian soldiers. What I would like to see, Mr. Speaker, is that, as I've said when I went through the clauses in the bill, is that we make provisions, changes to ensure that these brave soldiers, our soldiers, are protected by our government. Not just the administrative power, but the political directorate. What I have seen here, Mr. Speaker, is a colonial law, copied and pasted from legislation that goes back to our colonial past. It doesn't pay respect to the elected arm of government, and it strays quite often outside the scope of Section 55 of the Constitution. I'm particularly concerned with the ability in the bill of the governor to direct prosecutions against members of the public. I'm particularly concerned with the lack of regard for the office of the Premier. And Mr. Speaker, I'm concerned about the ability of the governor in the bill to bypass our immigration regime or any vetting process for admitting members into this regiment. I brought a motion recently, Mr. Speaker, that talked about belongership and my concerns with belongership. And in a certain manner, what is in this bill has enhanced those concerns. Mr. Speaker, I want to apologize to all those Caymanians who've already been recruited into the regiment. It was not my intention for them to get caught up in the middle of this debate. And as I said, I am proud of their commitment to their country and their willingness to serve this country. I'm not sure, Mr. Speaker, how the members of the government feel about my comments about this legislation being very colonialist in nature. But I really struggle, despite my sincere appreciation for the recruits and the regiment, to support this bill in its current form. That article I just read, Mr. Speaker, talks about the treatment of Indian soldiers after they'd sacrificed so much and given their lives. Put in more Caymanian ownership into this bill would most certainly avoid that sort of situation arising in the future. No governor should be able to order single-handedly Caymanians into harm's way while the elected cabinet sits impotent. This legislation, Mr. Speaker, is a revival of our colonial days. We have progressed 55 years since the Bermuda Regiment was created. But we are taking certain aspects of that legislation and trying to fit it into modern-day Cayman, and it's not going to work. Mr. Speaker, this is a lesson about self-respect, letting go of self-hatred, and avoiding future catastrophe. In January, we're going to honor our seafarers, those brave souls who have sacrificed equally to help build this country. Some gave their lives, and I don't think we should dishonor their memory by supporting legislation that is reviving a past that we're all trying to move forward from, and some of us are trying to forget. Speaker, today reminds me of why I entered politics. I left this country for 4 years to go live in one of the most segregated and cold cities on this planet, Chicago. But I would never trade that experience for anything, because the lessons I learned there are what contribute to the representative I am today. As soon as I returned to this country, Mr. Speaker, I immediately got involved in local politics, working with former ministers Roy Borden and Gilbert McLean. And today I'm standing here as the son of a Jamaican immigrant and a multi-generational Caymanian. I am proud to say that I am an example of what the Caymanian dream can deliver. Not just for me, but for all our people. And for me to support such a colonialist piece of legislation would be negligent, I believe. And it would be a disservice to all those who stood here before me and did so much so people like me could be here today and to advance this country. Mr. Speaker, I hope that the new members in this honorable House, like myself, will agree today that this bill needs to be sent back and changed. It does not represent the accomplishments of so many who have come before us, including, Mr. Speaker, members who are here today, the Honorable Premier, the Honorable Leader of the Opposition, yourself, Mr. Speaker, the member from Savannah, the two members from Cayman Bracken, Little Cayman, the member from West Bay, Central. They have paved the way, along with so many others who have passed through this honorable House. I hope that today we will reject this bill in its current form on the vote and ask that a new version be brought with amendments that will address the concerns raised by members on this side. We cannot allow a piece of legislation like this to pass into law. So, Mr. Speaker, I hope that, and I heard the Premier earlier say that he is going to take our considerations into our concerns into consideration, and that we will be presented with amendments that address a lot of these concerns. And so I am pleased to have heard that, and I'm looking for a reason, Mr. Speaker, to support this bill, or many reasons, but in its current form, it fails sadly, and it doesn't pay honor and respect to the accomplishments of this country up until this point in time. Thank you.
Does any other member wish to speak? The member from Bordentown West.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. Mr. Speaker, I rise to make my contribution to the defense bill that is currently before this honorable House. This defense bill gave me a lot to think about, and it was only last Saturday that I made up my mind as to what my approach on this bill would be. You see, Mr. Speaker, last week was my mom's birthday, and I usually surprise her by going to church. Whichever church is our Sabbath or the closest birthday to our Sabbath, that's when I normally show up. That's to kind of surprise her, but I don't think it's much of a surprise now because I've been doing it for so long. I think it's almost expected. Well, dear Mr. Speaker, the song Amazing Grace was sung, and at first it caught me a little bit off guard, as most of the time I hear that song, it is usually sung at funerals. But it was at that moment that I realized that I was blind, but now I see. Despite being written almost 250 years ago in 1772, Amazing Grace is easily one of the most recognizable hymns in the English-speaking world, being performed an estimated 10 million times per year. Ironically, Mr. Speaker, while it is often portrayed as a black spiritualist song, it was in fact written by John Newton, a white Englishman and a former slave trader. It is only by knowing the story of John Newton's life as a slave trader and the journey he went through before writing the hymn that you will understand the depth of his words and his gratefulness for God's truly amazing grace. Having lived through a rather unfortunate and troubled childhood, his mother passed away when he was just 6 years old. Newton spent years fighting against authority, going as far as trying to desert the Royal Navy in his 20s. Later, abandoned by his crew in West Africa, he was forced to be a servant to a slave trader, but was eventually rescued. On the return voyage to England, a violent storm hit and almost sank the ship, prompting Newton to begin his spiritual conversion as he cried out to God to save them from the storm. Upon his return, however, Newton became a slave ship master, a profession in which he served for several years. Bringing slaves from Africa to England over multiple trips, he admitted sometimes to treating the slaves very, very badly. In 1754, after becoming very sick on a voyage, Newton left his life as a slave trader. He left the slave trade, and he left the seafaring altogether. And he started to basically devote his entire life to serving God. Newton was ordained as an Anglican priest in 1764 and became quite popular as a preacher and hymn writer, penning some 280 hymns, among them the great Amazing Grace. In later years, Newton fought alongside William Wilberforce, leader of the parliamentary campaign to abolish the African slave trade. He described the horrors of the slave trade in a tract he wrote supporting the campaign and apologizing for participating in the trade. And Newton said, "It will always be a subject of humiliating reflection to me that I was once an instrument in a business at which my heart now shudders." Newton lived to see the British passage of the Slave Trade Act in 1807, resulting in the lyrics, "Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. His grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home." Mr. Speaker, the reason Amazing Grace impacted me is that during my college years, I came across that story, and it introduced me to the works and achievement of one William Wilberforce. William Wilberforce is one of the most significant figures in British politics. He was a member of Parliament in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, dedicating 45 years to the abolition of slavery and the slave trade. He was also a philanthropist and campaigner in other areas such as prison reform, medical aid for the poor, restrictions on child labor, education for the deaf, and better working conditions in factories. He also set up what became the RSPCA, the Royal Society for the Prevention and Cruelty to Animals, and is it any wonder he was called a man who changed his time? Mr. Speaker, the reason I decided to go back that far in history was because of some of the comments I heard regarding this bill. I think it is important for us to distinguish between the actions or inactions of the United Kingdom government, their local representative governor, and the good and decent British people. In short, Mr. Speaker, I'll not make my opinion of some members of the UK government and the governor become my views of the 68 million people that live in the United Kingdom. I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that I have family and close friends in the United Kingdom, and they are just as unhappy with some members of their government. And they, Mr. Speaker, like the many people that I represent, have serious concerns with this governor. It is those concerns, Mr. Speaker, that has impacted my position on this bill. Mr. Speaker, I won't keep you, the members of this honorable House, and more importantly, the good people of the Cayman Islands, how I intend to vote on this bill. I will tell you right now, Mr. Speaker, the bill as presented will not be supported by me. The only way that I will change my position is if this proposed regiment falls under the responsibility of the Premier. And Mr. Speaker, the Premier must accept some responsibility for my position. How many times during the press briefing that we heard the governor use the words, "I agree with the Honorable Premier"? And it was at that moment I realized what the Premier said sometime back in 2017 during one of my first sessions in this Legislative Assembly. And Mr. Speaker, I remember that night, I think it was the government strategic policy statement. It was the first one that the government was putting out at the time, and the Premier indicated that this would have been his final term, and he wanted to go bold, he wanted to go big, he wanted to go, and many of us on the opposition benches got up and agreed with the Premier in terms of what he wanted to do. Well, Mr. Speaker, when the Premier went to wrap up, he put it on us, basically telling us it's not our job to agree with the government. If we want to agree with the government, we join the government. It is our job to make sure that we keep the government in check and make sure that any legislation that comes down here actually is something that we really scrutinize. And in a sense, he told us to do our jobs. And that was probably one of the best advice I've ever gotten since being a member of this honorable House. Mr. Speaker, one of the primary reasons that I decided to enter politics was to push for legislation and policies that will improve the quality of lives of our people. The education that I have was paid for by the Cayman Islands, and I have a debt to repay by applying the knowledge that I gained from their investment. I also have the responsibility of doing my very best to lift up all Caymanians regardless of who they are. The Premier, his government, and all the members of this honorable House are not exempt from that commitment. And we must, as Caymanians, give credit where credit is due. Despite the negative impacts of this global pandemic, one positive that came out of it, it allowed the world to see that competence in government matters. I am sure that both the American people and the British people wish that the response and results of their governments would have been similar to Cayman's response and Cayman results. Mr. Speaker, do you really and truly think that after seeing the UK's government pitiful response to this global pandemic, that I would trust them or their representative with the lives of the Caymanian people? Mr. Speaker, it was reported that more than 43,500 people in the UK have died because of COVID-19. That is almost 70% of our population. When I compare that number to the amount of Caymanians that have died from COVID-19, which is zero, you want me to entrust the lives of our young people to them? Really, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, during the Premier's debate on this bill, he mentioned that he wanted this regiment from the first time in Cabinet between 2005 and 2009 and got no support from the Governor or the UK. I want to read something here, Mr. Speaker, that may shed some light as to why. Chris, wait a sec. Give this speaker here for me. There is several of them, Mr. Speaker, so I've kind of numbered each of those, Mr. Speaker, so you can go along if you wanted. This was an article from BBC News back in 23rd of July 2011, Mr. Speaker. And the headline reads, "The time when the British Army was really stretched." And the article reads as follows, and I'm just only going to be doing pretty much the first page, Mr. Speaker, and part of the third page. And it says, "The British Army is due to be reduced to 82,000 by 2020, prompting claims it will be the smallest it has been since the 19th century. But if Britain had a small army then, how did it control an empire? Think of the British Army during the late 19th century, and you might conjure up images of Zulu or carry up on the Kibber. Considering the British Empire at its peak included a quarter of the world's population, one would imagine the army was more like Michael Caine and Stanley Baker from the former than Kenneth Williams and Sid James from the latter. But the British Empire managed to maintain hegemony over dozens of colonies with a relatively tiny number of men. Defense Secretary Liam Fox announced this week he planned to cut regular army numbers to 82,000 to 120,000 in total, including the Territorial Army, by 2020. It was widely reported that this was the smallest it had been since the Boer War." And just going up to page 3, just want to read that part there, Mr. Speaker. It says, military historian Dr. Davis from King's College London points out India was garrisoned by hundreds of thousands of locally recruited sepoys, supervised by fewer than 30,000 British troops. The empire had to pay for itself and had to be profitable. And if you were too much into building up the army, the empire is no longer a profitable enterprise, he says. Mr. Speaker, the same conservative government that cut the troops back then in 2011 is now the same conservative government that actually wants to increase the number of troops. In September 2014, 3 years after that decision was made, there was a NATO conference in Wales, and one of the things that came out of the conference was that the UK troop levels were well below what it needs to be. And I want you to take a look, Mr. Speaker. I want to read an article here that was carried in the Financial Times, and the headline read, "Britain's withered forces not fit to repel all-out attack." And the headline also said, former military chief Sir Richard Barron's issued a stark warning over skinning budgets. And the article goes on to read, and I'm just only going to be reading the first page of that one, Mr. Speaker, but I included the full article because I know you like to read these things. It says, Britain's armed forces cannot defend the UK against a serious military attack and have lost much of their ability to fight conventional wars, the recently retired head of the country's Joint Forces Command has warned. General Sir Richard Barrons, who stepped down in April as one of the country's 4 service chiefs, had said a series of profoundly difficult strategic challenges are being sidestepped as Whitehall focuses on skinning budgets and delivering costly but increasingly redundant big-ticket military projects. His 10-page private memorandum to Michael Fallon, Defence Minister, is the most forthright criticism of defence policy from the UK's senior military leadership to have emerged publicly in years. It came just months after the last spending review under the Ministry of Defence, as a significant funding boost despite widespread cuts to other departments. The General's detailed analysis will raise grave concern in NATO. Britain has long cast itself as a linchpin of the Alliance's European military power base, but the US has voiced doubts about its diminishing capabilities since the troubled campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, Mr. Speaker, what kind of really led me along this train of thought was a letter that was actually published by local attorney Peter Polak. And It was also read on the for the record show by OC, and it was also carried in another Caribbean newspaper. And the letter reads, "The editor, Madam, the recent announcement by the new United Kingdom Defence Attaché that the UK wishes to expand its relationship with Caribbean nations comes on the cusp of an offer in 2015 by the UK to build a prison in the island for Jamaicans in UK prisons. This was rejected even more so in light of a recent Windrush scandal that has adversely affected so many Caribbean people. The UK Ministry of Defence raised the enlistment age limit to its Armed Reserve in November 2014 to 52 from 43, as part of a plan to reduce the regular army by bolstering the number of reservists because of a manpower shortage. Since Brexit, the UK has been scrambling to shore up their shortage of soldiers by establishing military units in British overseas territories to provide a ready supply of troops for prompt deployment. This initiative has been given short shrift in some jurisdictions such as Cayman Islands, despite the pleas of the UK representative there. There has been continuous debate in Britain over the minimum enlistment age of boys in the military. A boy can apply for military enlistment in England at the age of 15 years and 7 months, with parental consent to join at 16 years old. A wide band of supporters in that country have campaigned for the increase to 18 years old, and that they should not see combat before 19. It has fallen on deaf ears. The UK military has repeatedly allowed 17-year-old boys and girls into combat zone.
Honourable member, a member from...
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt the honourable member and mid-speech, but he is reading from a document that standing orders provide members should have copies of as well. So I would ask the chair if we can satisfy that need.
Yeah, I've been following as I've been given copies, and he is reading correctly, but might be that if he can read more extensively, he might want to or should give members a copy.
Well, I'm actually finished. You can get this copy now. The Caribbean people love their children and will not follow the UK over that precipice. Chris, you can give this copy to the honourable member from Prospect for me. Well, you get some copies for all members, yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Now, Mr. Speaker, when you also look at the other two that I've labeled, 4 and 5, I'm just going to read headlines. British Army, this was written in August 2019, Friday the 9th of August 2019. British Army recruitment shortfalls may be a symptom of changing times. And it says, legacy of controversial Middle East conflicts and falling unemployment are among the deterrents. And it goes on, there's a link there says, UK Army combat units 40% below strength as recruitment plummets. And then there's also, Mr. Speaker, this other one that was recently published in February of this year. It says UK Army years off full strength despite recruitment drive and so forth. So there are challenges with recruitment within the UK, Mr. Speaker, and I do understand that. And it's kind of weird because going back to 2011, their plan was to have troops lowered by 2020. And of course, it seems that it was a little bit too successful because now they have actually reduced their troop levels well below where they expected it to be or where they wanted it to be. And now it seems as if though there is, they're trying to play catch up on their own recruiting. Now, Mr. Speaker, it has been said that the Cayman Islands Regiment is not a part of the British Army. If that is the case, can someone in the government get someone to reach out to Wikipedia and correct their information where it says that the Cayman Islands Regiment is part of the British Army? And
Honourable member, be careful how you read Wikipedia. Wikipedia is contributed, and I say this to this Honourable House, is written by contributors that are biased in all shapes and forms. Some of them are outright liars. Some of them themselves are crooks. Some of them are the dirtiest people you want to find in the world. Yet they write and they accuse us and they say all sorts of manner of evil about us. I've just read one about myself, that this is my second wife. That was one thing they just read, that this is my second wife, and that was just a small part of the terrible mistakes, outright mistakes. If I had money, I would sue them, but I don't have money as much as people think I got. So be careful how you read about Wikipedia. The Premier.
Mr. Speaker, thank you for that, but I wish to raise a point of order with respect to what the member has just alleged. Mr. Speaker, I read not once but twice from Section 347 of the British Armed Forces Act, which makes it clear that the regular army means any of Her Majesty's military forces other than A, the Army Reserve, B, the Territorial Army, and C, forces raised under the law of a British overseas territory. And so, Mr. Speaker, it is entirely out of order for the member to suggest that somehow Wikipedia or some other entity should be the authority on this particular point. The point is not in question. The Act, the British Armed Forces Act, says what I've just read. This is not a matter for dispute or opinion.
An honourable member for Don West.
Thank you,
Continuing.
Mr. Speaker, and that's the reason why I asked for the government to have someone reach out to them, because I know they do take. So just to get that clarified, because people actually read these things and will actually believe them too. So I just wanted to make sure I put that out there and just see what we can do, because they're actually quite comprehensive in a lot of the stuff that they have here from the very commanding officer. And I know sometimes, Mr. Speaker, that they do get submissions. So like we said, we just want to make sure the government has the correct information out there so that people can rely on that.
And the honourable members, you would realize that Wikipedia it depends on who's writing and giving the information. I don't withdraw what I said about some of the contributors.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, I actually want to shift gears and get down to the actual bill itself. My first issue with the bill, Mr. Speaker, is that the word premier is actually mentioned 4 times in the actual law, or the proposed law, and the governor is actually mentioned 132 times. Now, Mr. Speaker, just for ease of reference, starting on page 17, section 8B, it says just the 4 references to where the premier is referred. It says in 8B, the governor acting in the governor's discretion may delegate functions relating to the operations of the regiment to any minister after consultation with the premier. And then also on page 21 of the draft legislation here, it also says in 14.3, the governor may consult the premier and may, in the governor's discretion, allow persons not meeting the requirements of subsection 1 to be enlisted into the regiment if the governor considered this to be in the best interest of the regiment. And then also again on page 27, Mr. Speaker, it says 28.3, the governor shall seek the agreement of the premier before embodying the regiment for deployment to a foreign state, but agreement is not required for deployment within the islands or another British overseas territory. And then section 28.2, just right above it, Mr. Speaker, says the governor shall consult the premier before making an order after subsection 1 unless the governor consider this to be impractical. Now, I am happy to see, based on the committee stage amendments that has been filed, that the word impractical is actually being removed. Because that word had actually bothered me, Mr. Speaker, when considering that the definition of impractical means, in terms of an object or course of action, not adapted for use or action, not sensible or realistic. Similar words to impractical, Mr. Speaker, are unsuitable, inappropriate, impossible, unrealistic, unworkable, unfeasible, non-viable, ill-considered, illogical, unreasonable, far-fetched, silly, foolish, cockeyed, crackpot, crazy, and half-baked. So having language like that inside a bill, and I'm really happy to see that that has come out, because that one had really got under my skin. To say that to consult with the Premier, he doesn't need to, because it is impractical. That was a little bit too of a strong language for me to have that word inside here to deal with someone who's a duly elected person of this, of the people of the Cayman Islands and the majority of members in this honorable House. Mr. Speaker, there's also a concern that I have with this bill, and I'm just going to go through my concerns, because as I was reading it, I was actually making my notes. And I start with on page 16, when it says military service to be performed in and outside of the islands. And one of the things that caught me a little bit off guard, Mr. Speaker, was that we were told that this bill was supposed to be similar to what they had in Bermuda. And in Bermuda, they started out by saying military service to be performed in Bermuda except annual camp. And the Defense Act of 1965, taken from Bermuda, reads, subject to section 211, nothing in this act shall require any person to perform any military service or any non-combatant duty connected with military service outside Bermuda. So right off the bat, Mr. Speaker, we have a different definition in terms of how it is that we started out, and ours read, a member of the regiment may be required to perform military services, including training and non-combatant services, both in and outside of the islands at the direction of the governor. I would very much like, for ease of reference and peace of mind, Mr. Speaker, that when we're looking at changes, we clearly define what military service is, because some of the stuff that I see being included under the definition of military services is not something that I would really like for some of our people to be involved in at this time or at any time. Also, on page 17, Mr. Speaker, on the duties of the regiment, it goes on to say the regiment is responsible for, and it lists out the defense of the islands, provide humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, assisting the Royal Cayman Islands Police Service and the Coast Guard when called upon to do so by the governor, and D, such other duties as the governor determines. That part 5.1D, Mr. Speaker, such other duties as the governor determines, we need to have some level of limits on this. This is a little bit too broad. And when you go through the actual bill itself, Mr. Speaker, you realize at no point in this bill do I see anything where the governor has to consult with the Secretary of State, the Minister of Defense, or anything. And the reason why this is an issue for me, Mr. Speaker, is that in this day and age, it is given in developed countries that have military services that there is civilian oversight of the use of military services. And to basically just take this kind of power and put it into one person is definitely an issue that needs to be dealt with. Also, move to page 18 on the bill, Mr. Speaker. Part 2, it says Defense Board and a Defense Medical Officer. The first thing I would like in Section 9, the law, Can someone please tell me what this defense board is supposed to do? All it has is just made up of members. It has nothing in terms of what their remit, their terms of reference, or anything is. And then I noticed in the Bermuda bill, it has a defense medical officer. Sorry, in Bermuda they have a defense medical board, but here we have a defense medical officer. I would like to understand why the difference between a board in Bermuda versus just having an officer in Cayman. I'm just trying to understand the practicalities, since we were basically told that we are trying to mirror Bermuda as much as possible with this legislation. And then also in 9.6, which I believe is going to be corrected, it says, at every meeting of the board, a quorum shall consist of a simple majority of members present, and decisions shall be adopted by a simple majority. Now I see where there's a committee stage amendment for that, so that at least solves my issues with that one. Going over to page 19, Mr. Speaker, part 3, recruitment, organization, government training, pay and allowances for the regiment. It basically says, in this section that deals with command of the regiment, it says, issue a handbook, a code of practice, or such other guidelines as the commanding officer may see fit for the guidance, government, and regulation of members of the regiment. Again, Mr. Speaker, I would really like to have an answer. Who's going to be reviewing this handbook? Who's going to be signing off on it? Is this something that will be the remit of the defense board? These are the kind of things we just need to just clear up on, because like I said, it's given a lot of power to very few individuals where there's no level of accountability. And as I said before, this is not how modern societies work. And then on 13, page 20, 13.5, it basically says, governor's order shall not be inconsistent with any of the provisions of this law. And again, I think that's one of the things that needs some level of clarification, because of the simple fact that it's too broad and we don't see where there's any kind of oversight or anything. 14 was one of them that kind of also got in my craw, Mr. Speaker. On page 21, when it says enlistment and period of service. Now, going back to Bermuda's, from their website here, and this is from the website of, I think that's item number 7, labeled on the part that I gave you, Mr. Speaker. It says Royal Bermuda Regiment, and under the section service obligations, there's a section that says, that deals with volunteering, and it says, men and women who are between the ages of 18 and 45 are Commonwealth citizens, residents of Bermuda, are able to seek employment and meet security clearances, may volunteer to serve. And then this is the part that's important. Work permit holders must provide a letter of permission from their employer. Now, Mr. Speaker, we have, in terms of our enlistment in 14.1a, a Commonwealth, okay, so just read it for listening public easier. Subject to directions of the governor in section 15, a person who is 18 years of age or no more than 50 years of age and who is a Commonwealth or Irish citizen, who is a permanent resident of the islands in accordance with Immigration Transition Law 2018, or B, a British Overseas Territorial citizen or a British citizen, and is either a Caymanian or permanent resident within the meaning of the Immigration Transition Law 2018, may be enlisted into the regiment in such manner and subject to such conditions as are provided under this law and as prescribed. Now, the thing about it is, Mr. Speaker, I noticed further on in the bill, it basically speaks about once the regiment is embodied, that basically people should be allowed to, employers basically have to allow them to do whatever duties this is. And I think considering and using the page 103 of the 2019 Compendium of Statistics, I want us to fully understand what we're opening the door for without putting some limits on work permit holders who are Commonwealth citizens. Mr. Speaker, according to the ESO, which includes, they got this information from the the Cayman Islands Immigration Department that ESO compiled, and it's page 103 of the Companion Statistics. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. We have 20 countries where we have nationals from the work permit that are also Commonwealth citizens. And if the intention, and just for ease of reference, Mr. Speaker, we have Australia with Australian nationals with 175 work permits. Bahamas has 16, Bangladesh has 10, Barbados has 115, Belize has 54, Canada has 1,076, Guyana has 289, India has 1,218, Kenya has 115, Malaysia has 8, Mauritius has 22, New Zealand has 68, Pakistan has 11, South Africa has 270, Sri Lanka has 128, St. Vincent and Grenadines 30, St. Lucia 45, Trinidad and Tobago 113, United Kingdom 1,708, and there's one little small island of Jamaica that has 11,703. The total amount using the 2019 numbers, Mr. Speaker, is 17,274. And we need to make it perfectly clear in this legislation, because I don't think the Bermuda legislation is clear that work permit holders at a minimum needs to get the permission of their employer. Because if you have people now where they are required to go to camp, and the bill as proposed basically states that these people must be allowed to train, and your employers can't stop them and can't take the vacation pay from them, that needs to be fixed, because a lot of small businesses can't afford for people to basically be going down doing these weekend camps and everything else. So I'm asking the government to make sure that is something that is covered, that protects our employers, because a lot of the security personnel that we have here that work for some of these firms are from India and those different places. And if those guys decided to go and sign up for the regiment and they have to get their time off to go and train, that's going to be a problem. So it is a volunteer service, but there's a part where it becomes almost mandatory listening to the bill or reading the bill, and we need to make sure we protect our businesses in that regard. So that's one of the amendments that definitely needs to be made to protect our businesses. What I don't want is people going in and signing up and getting weekends off, and then the employer still has to pay them. So I think that language definitely needs to be clarified. Moving on, Mr. Speaker, to page 22, 16.1, it says an officer may at any time apply in the prescribed manner to the governor for permission to relinquish the officer's commission, and the governor, after considering the circumstances, may grant an application. Well, what happens if the governor don't grant it? Then what? You're going to lock them up? You're going to charge them? You're going to fine them? I mean, you're asking people to volunteer for something, but then you need permission to quit. I mean, these are the kind of stuff I think that we need to definitely look into clean up, Mr. Speaker. And also in section 16.3, that speaks about relinquishment of commission, that same area. It says, the governor shall not require an officer to relinquish the officer's commission or dismiss an officer until the governor has consulted the commanding officer, and where the officer is charged with misconduct or neglect of duty, unless the officer has been given full opportunity to exculpate himself or herself before a court of inquiry, consisting of officers, each of whom is an officer either of Her Majesty's Armed Forces or the regiment appointed by the governor to inquire into the report on all the circumstances of the case. How many officers are they talking about? I mean, is this going to be like in the U.S., some judge, advocate, general type stuff? There still limits a number of officers that has to be present. It's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 officers, I don't know. But I think this needs to be clear that if a person is going to be tried, at least we know what the amount of jury members should be or the amount of officers should be. Going over to, I was just curious in section 17 in terms of those who can keep their rank. I noticed it basically took the rank of major and above. And I was just curious as to why people who have attained the rank of captain or so can't maintain their rank. I mean, we have many captains in Cayman, so I was a little bit curious about that. And maybe that is something that can be looked at. Also, Mr. Speaker, Part 5, exempted services, which is Section 18 of the bill, it reads, subject to subsection 3, where a member of the regiment is employed both by the regiment and by an exempted service, the member's employment obligation to the exempted service take priority over the member's employment obligations to the regiment. Fine, I can live with that. And it says in Part 2, for purposes of subsection 1, an exempted service means A, Her Majesty's Armed Forces, B, the Fire and Rescue Service, C, the Police Service, D, the Prison Service, E, the Coast Guard, F, an officer of the Hazard Management Cayman Islands, G, services as an emergency technician or a paramedic for a hospital, or H, a person in holy orders or a minister in any religious denomination recognized by the governor as such for the purpose of this law. I was just curious as to why CBC wasn't included here. I don't know if it was an oversight, but again, this is something I would consider, because I would at least think that people that are employed in Customs and Border Control should also be included on this list. So I think that's one of the things I would ask the government to seriously consider, exempting the Customs and Border Control. Section 18.2, that's on page 23 of the bill. So maybe it could have just been an oversight, but I just think that Customs and Border Control should also be included. So maybe that's something that we can look at during the committee stage. Then there's also in section 21 on page 24, Mr. Speaker, and this area deals with the power to dispense with military training. And it says the requirements of section 20 may be dispensed with, in whole or in part, A, in respect to any subunit of the regiment by the governor, and B, in respect of individual members of the regiment by the governor or subject to the governor's order by the commanding officer. I made a note here that just had a big question mark that says why. And the reason why I'm raising this issue, Mr. Speaker, is that when you get up and you say that the regiment is there to support the police, the Coast Guard, and etc., at a minimum, we need for these people to be trained. So if it's a situation where they're not going to be going out there and offering any level of support, then that is fine. But if not, I think that is something where they definitely need to have some level of mandatory training, because the last thing you want is people who aren't trained going out with people who are fully trained. So I think that's definitely one of the issues that we need to look at. And again, going on to section 23, commanding officer may excuse from military training on application of employer. And it says in 23.1, an employer of a person who is a member of the regiment may apply to the commanding officer for the person employed to be excused in whole or in part from attendance at annual camp as required by section 20 on the ground that the employer would thereby be caused undue hardship. Now, again, Mr. Speaker, I do understand in terms of Caymanian employees having, or Caymanian people having the right to join this regiment, but again, when you start thinking about people on work permit, and you look at over 17,000 people that can possibly take this up, what happens if a person is on work permit, the employer has paid his work permit fees, the person goes sign up for camp, and the employer is facing hardship, and the commander says no? What happened to that employer? What happened to that business? Again, like I said, if this is supposed to be a volunteer service and everything else, we get it. I think it's best served through some level of cooperation, and I think it's best in some cases where they do get the permission from the employer to do so. But what we don't want is people to just being able to sign up because they're a Commonwealth citizen, and then the employer is left to turn off the lights when that person doesn't show up to work. And then on page 25, and it says under section 25, offense of failure to complete military training. And it says a member of the regiment who without reasonable excuse the proof of which shall be upon the person, fails, A, to complete the annual training which by or under this law the person is required to undergo, or B, to attend the number of drills during any particular period in accordance with the directions of the commanding officer given under this law, commits an offense and is liable on summary conviction to a fine equal to 28 days pay or to imprisonment for a term of 3 months or to both. Now, at a big sign here, Mr. Speaker, that said, really? You asking people to volunteer and then you're going to tell them if they don't show up for drill or camp, you're going to take away their money and possibly lock them up? I mean, I think that language is a little bit strong, and I think that's one of the issues that the honourable member from Northside also raised. Now, Mr. Speaker, as you Section 8 that deals with embodiment of the regiment, one of the issues I have just listening to how this thing goes off, it says in 28.6, a police officer or any member of the regiment, a police officer or any member of the regiment, A, may arrest without warrant any member of the regiment whom the police officer or the member believes on reasonable grounds to have committed an offense under this section. B, shall convey a member who is arrested to the commanding officer or to such place as appointed by the commanding officer to be dealt with according to law. And C, may convey under arrest any person convicted of an offense to such place as may be appointed by the officer or designated by the commanding officer, by the governor, or by the court. I need some clarification on that section, Mr. Speaker, because A, if you have people who are not being trained as police or not showing up for training, and then you're basically giving them the power to go out and arrest other people, I think that is something that needs to be looked at, because at the end of the day, the ability to arrest people requires specialized training and a certain process. And I think at a minimum, we need to have minimum standards inside here. So I don't know if that's something that regulations would deal with, if they're intended to be regulations or something, but just the ability of people to go out and arrest people without the proper training is definitely an issue for me. And then on page 28, it deals with section 29, that speaks about Armed Forces Act, applies when undertaking duty with or training with UK regular or reserve forces. And 29.1 reads, Mr. Speaker, subject to subsection 28, every member of the regiment shall, while undertaking any duty or training with regular or reserve forces outside the islands, be subject to this law and military law under the Armed Forces Act, and the Armed Forces Act shall apply to each member of the regiment as if the member were a member of the regular or reserve forces. We have inside here, Mr. Speaker, that our regiment can be deployed to other British overseas territory citizens, which I think most people are other British overseas territory islands. I think most people will agree that the other BOTC islands are outside the Cayman Islands, and I want to know if someone shows up to do a humanitarian aid in Turks or something, if all of a sudden now they are now subject to all of these laws and everything as per the Armed Forces Act. So the minute they leave the Cayman Islands, they become subject to this different law. And again, this comes back again to the training issue. Do people fully understand what it is that they're signing up for? And have they gone through that act itself in terms of what it actually entails? I mean, I've read it, and it mostly deals with discipline and some of the other stuff too, but I think at a minimum, that needs to be communicated to many of the volunteers. I won't touch on that one. Too much people touch on that one. I ignore that. On page 29, Mr. Speaker, that deals with commanding officers ensure that the Commissioner of Police is aware of the possibility that a criminal offense has been committed. And that section 33.1 reads, if the commanding officer becomes aware of an allegation or circumstances within subsection 2, the commanding officer shall, as soon as reasonably practical, ensure that the Commissioner of Police is advised of the matter. And then 2, an allegation is or circumstances are within the subsection if it or they would indicate to a reasonable person that a civil offense as or may have been committed by a member of the regiment. Mr. Speaker, crimes are crimes, and I don't see this part about commanding officer as soon as possible to report it to the Commissioner of Police. I mean, why the Commissioner of Police? Why not 911? Why not anybody else as a F normal? Why not any gazetted officer? I mean, this issue of limiting an issue where you report to the Commissioner of Police, I do have an issue with that part. I mean, this is where you entertain cover-up, and this is where either something is reported to the Defense Board or some level of civilian oversight, but just the commanding officer and the Commissioner of Police having a conversation about a crime being committed and all that kind of stuff it just freaks me out in this day and age, and that is not something that I think any democracy should be even striving for. That you just have 2 people sitting down and deciding, well, this is what happened, what do you think we should do, kind of thing. So I think that needs to be expanded to at least any police officer that's gazetted or something. If the intention that you want is somebody senior to look at it, I think it should be open to all the senior ranks of the police force, but not a commissioner of police who, I don't think in my lifetime I may ever see a Cayman police force commissioner again, but this is definitely a no-no. Are you basically saying that the deputy commissioner or a superintendent of police this can't be reported to them? So I think that is one of the things that definitely needs to be fixed. That's the kind of stuff that basically reads, that kind of smacks of potential cover-up and all that kind of stuff, and we don't need that. There is a section on a section 40, but I'm hoping that maybe the Attorney General can shed some light in terms of some of those issues, penalty and summary conviction and those kind of stuff. Because this thing is going into some serious court issues here, Mr. Speaker. And one of the things I just want to also touch on is section 48 of the law that deals with contravention of certain provisions not to be criminal offenses. And I just want to make sure if things happen within the regiment and somebody is convicted of something, I mean, does this give them a police record or anything like that? So I think that part needs to be clear, just to make sure in terms of where these things stop or where everything else starts at. But I think that section needs to be cleared up also. And then part 10, general section 52, kind of really caught me off guard, and maybe the Honorable Deputy Governor can help me with this one. It says, where a person who is a member of the regiment, A, suffers disablement or is killed as a result of undergoing military training under this law, or B, suffers disablement or is killed as a result of service in the regiment when embodied, that person or the person's dependent shall be eligible for a grant of such pension as the governor may determine after consultation with the minister responsible for finance. Now, I think that's actually a good section in terms of having some protection for people who put themselves forward for service. But I'd just be curious to find out if similar laws or similar language exists in the police law, the fire law, and also the CBC law, and also. Yep, so I think, and the fire service also? Okay, so, okay, perfect. The member for Northside has filed an amendment for that. And then basically, this goes back to section 54, Mr. Speaker. Duty of employer. An employer shall not prevent an employee from A, enlisting in the regiment, B, undergoing military training and attending drills or annual camp, or C, subject to section 18, being in active service of the regiment when the regiment is embodied. And then 2, it goes on to say, where a member of the regiment is in the regular employment of another person and is required to undergo military training, attend drills, attend annual camp, or to be in active service when the regiment is embodied, then the employer of of the member shall allow the member to undertake such activities, and A, the employer shall ensure that any leave or holiday to which the member would ordinarily be entitled or for which the member would ordinarily be eligible shall not be prejudiced or restricted by reason of the member undertaking such activities. The employer shall ensure that any promotion, privilege, or advantage in connection with employment of the member to which the member would ordinarily be entitled or for which the member would ordinarily be eligible shall not be prejudiced by any undertaking such activities. And then it is 54.3, Mr. Speaker, that says, an employer who contravenes subsection 1 or 2 commits an offense and is liable on summary conviction to a fine of $5,000, and where an employer is convicted of an offense under this section, the court by which the employer is convicted may make such order giving effect to any provision of subsection 1 as the court thinks just. So, Mr. Speaker, just for me to understand this, we have over 17,500 persons employed on work permit from Commonwealth countries as per the 2019 Economic and Statistics Compendium. We're saying then that if those persons go and sign up to do all of this work, the drills, the training, and everything, and if an employer, particular small business, basically prevents the employee or that kind of from going, they must now pay a fine of $5,000, when in some cases the work permit itself doesn't even cost that much. So again, Mr. Speaker, I think this is one area that really needs to be tidied up for a service that is supposed to be voluntary. So I think at a minimum, we need to put some level of protection inside here for the business people in terms of the employees, especially those on work permit. Because if I'm paying the money to bring somebody in and doing all that kind of stuff, and somebody decided to embody the regiment or have all of these training drills and everything else, these things can easily affect employees. And when you consider that it could be somebody's gardener, it could be somebody's domestic helper, it's basically open to anybody. And I don't think many Caymanians' home can survive if the helper decided, you know what, at 34, 35 years, I've always wanted to shoot a gun, let me go sign up and get time off from work, and the employer can't do anything. And some people get stuck with a fine of up to $5,000 because somebody wants to go shoot gun on weekend and so forth. So again, I think this needs to have some level of protection or some level of control, or maybe, do the drill stuff. Now, this is the part, again, Mr. Speaker, section 55, 2. Well, 1 and 2. Equipment to be returned on discharge. Now, that section basically deals with once a person is leaving, they're basically supposed to return back their the equipment and everything that was being given to them. And then section 2 says a person who fails to comply. Matter of fact, no, I'm going to read it so it'll be easier. 55.1 reads, where a member of the regiment is discharged, relinquishes the member's commission, or is dismissed, it shall be the person's duty to deliver up in good order, fair wear and tear only excepted, all arms, including firearms, clothing, and equipment, being public property, issued to the person or in the charge of the person, or in any case where the delivery of the property is impossible, it shall be the person's duty to pay into the revenue of the government the value thereof. And then 55.2 reads, a person who fails to comply with subsection 1 commits an offense and is liable on summary conviction to a fine equal to 7 days' pay or to imprisonment for a term of 1 month or to do both. Now, when you put firearms above there and then tell me or tell the public in this bill that if a person don't turn in their firearm, they're subject to 7 days or imprisonment for 1 term, I think that needs to be tightened up, because there's no way if a person decides that they lost their gun or they couldn't find their gun that they're only subject to 7 days pay or to 1 month in prison, when we normal people be locked up for a lot more than that. So I think that language needs to be tightened up, and I would really like for the Attorney General or someone, what's that? Well, I mean, I don't know if they have guns or not, but I can only say what the law says. And the law clearly says arms including firearms. Now, unless you're putting a firecracker on a slingshot, I still think somewhere along that is a firearm. But either way, Mr. Speaker, the point is, depends on what it is that a person doesn't return. But it can't be a situation where if you don't return a gun or whatever, it's 7 days pay and up to 1 month in prison. That needs to be tightened up. And then Section 60, Mr. Speaker, on page 39, general offenses and powers of arrest. And it basically goes down to, basically reads, a person who willfully obstructs or otherwise interfere with a member of the regiment acting in the execution of the member's duty commits an offense. 2, a member of the regiment, while carrying out duties, may arrest without warrant, A, any person whom the member of the regiment believes on reasonable grounds to have committed an offense under subsection 1, and B, any person to whom the member of the regiment believes on reasonable grounds is about to or has committed an offense. And then 60, section 3 says, a person arrested for committing an offense in accordance with subsection 2 shall be taken by a member of the regiment as soon as possible to a police officer. And 4 says, a person who commits an offense under subsection 1 is liable on summary conviction to a fine of $2,000 or to imprisonment for a term of 6 months or both. Mr. Speaker, this is a fundamental challenge to, I don't want to say rule of law, but democracy itself. First of all, the only people in a country that normally outside of a state of emergency that have the power to arrest anybody is the police. I mean, if you go to even other Caribbean islands, I mean, using Jamaica, for example, where they have a group of police they refer to as Rat Pack. That's normally consists of 1 police and 3 soldiers. And the reason why the police is there, Mr. Speaker, is that the police is the only group that is charged with arresting or has the power to arrest. So to give police powers to people who may not even be showing up at training is definitely a no-no. So I think, again, these are the kind of things that need to be tightened up. I don't know if it's going to be done in the regulations or whatever, but this section as it is, section 60, 1, 2, 3, and 4, that whole situation needs to be tightened up. But to give volunteer personnel the ability to go out and arrest people and all that kind of stuff, and then it says a person arrested for committing an offense in accordance with subsection 2 shall be taken by a member of the regiment as soon as possible to a police officer. What are they doing at that in between that time? Detaining them? Where are they detaining them? You know, so I think that needs to be sorted out. And then section 61, Mr. Ting there, it deals with application of laws to civilian. And it basically speaks about people who's embodied with the military being subject to their rules and everything else. And I think we just need to understand, if we're talking about civilian contractors, I mean, there's journalists who sometimes go out along with these people are being deployed. Are they the ones being subjected there? So I think that also needs to be tightened up also. The thing about it is, Mr. Speaker, we were told from get-go that this regiment is supposed to kind of follow in Bermuda. And I think it's important, Mr. Speaker, to understand that the Bermuda Regiment, going back to the Bermuda militia, is over 400 years old. And I think it's important for people to understand why Bermuda had a militia from going back so far. And the answer, Mr. Speaker, actually lies in Bermuda's geography. In terms, if you understand the Bermuda's position between North America and Europe and understand the trade winds, you will understand why Bermuda had a militia, and also is one of the reasons why the United States also had a Navy base in Bermuda. One of the things also, Mr. Speaker, if you're going back again and you're looking at just the geographical reason, it is also the same reason, and sailors like Mr. Miller and Mr. McLean and those who went to sea, or at least shouldn't say went to sea, but those who understand the trade winds itself will understand why the U.S. had bases in Guantanamo, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the United States Virgin Islands. And once they start looking into that, they'll then understand the importance of the Windward Passage, the Mona Passage, and the Anegada Passage. But the point I'm making, Mr. Speaker, is that it was a geographic reason why Bermuda had this militia, or regiment, and also why the U.S. Navy had a base in Bermuda. And the thing about it is, Mr. Speaker, when I look at this bill itself, we and the Caymanian people have been told that this is mostly a defense, well, a humanitarian to help support and all that kind of stuff. And we are limited in this bill, because my discomfort with this bill also, Mr. Speaker, is that the title alone, the defense bill, automatically makes it a Section 55 issue. It is completely under the governor's control. And I would really like for us to, I don't know if we can find a different word to use or something, but at a minimum, give the Premier a little bit more control. Because the thing about it is, Mr. Speaker, is that, as my colleague from Newlands pointed out, this is a colonial bill. Slice it and dice it any way you want. It is a colonial bill. You know what I mean? And I think, like with anything else, I think it is time now for us to even start expanding what it is that we can do. And if there's anybody that I would really like to see be in charge of this bill, this regiment, is really and truly the Premier. And I'm being realistic. And the thing about it is, Mr. Speaker, when you do look at the areas that the governor is already has direct responsibility for, or some level of oversight, whether it's the police, I mean, you see the challenges. So if it's supposed to be mostly humanitarian missions and disaster relief and support, I think we have enough collective brains in this house to find a way to at least, here's a project that the elected government can go and deal with, or at a minimum, get the elected government more involved with it. I mean, you look at our current law enforcement and custodial departments, they all have one thing in common. The police who investigate the crime, the DPP that prosecute the crime, and the prison service that punishes the offenders, all have a non-Caymanian majority. And I bet if this regiment came under the Premier or a Caymanian, that we wouldn't see that problem. I'm almost willing to bet that. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, when the Premier is closing on his debate, I would very much like for him to provide an update on the progress of the Coast Guard, if that is possible, and where we are with recruitment numbers. I would just really like to know that. Mr. Speaker, I look at the police force. I look at the number of Caymanians that have left, especially those in senior position, and I ask myself why. It is clear that there are issues there that needs to be fixed, and I would suggest that we get the governor to fix those issues and those departments that are on his direct constitutional responsibility before we start giving him more work. I'm willing to bet, Mr. Speaker, I'm willing to bet that if we allow the Premier to run with this regiment and be in charge of it, I'm almost willing to bet that when he's done, you can hear the governor once again say, I agree with the Honorable Premier. Because that's a lot of what we got throughout the whole press conference. I agree with the Honorable Premier. So, Mr. Speaker, I accept that there's a generational gap between the thinking of myself and others in this Honorable House, and I get it. But rather than follow Bermuda, let us do what we do best and lead. There is no reason for us to go back and try to reinvent something that Bermuda has for more than 400 years. When in fact, if you look at the history and development of Cayman, it is completely different and unique from that of Bermuda. And Mr. Speaker, I don't want to go back over the point that I made, but part of our uniqueness and our success comes from the fact that we were the last of all the British territories to be colonized. And as a result, our own people are able to develop organically and do a lot more for themselves, as opposed to many of our cousins in the Caribbean elsewhere. And it seems as if though there is full steam ahead to make sure that for all the 300-400 years that Cayman wasn't colonized, that we need to get it a little bit done quicker to bring Cayman up to speed so we can get their mindset the way that other islands are. 'Cause, Mr. Speaker, I tell you something, we got some face people in Cayman, We got some people in Cayman that know exactly what it is that they're doing, and they don't take no check from any people, And part of that comes from, as I said, Mr. Speaker, of us being left alone for so long and being able to develop for so long. Bermuda was actually a British crown colony going back to the 1624, I believe. Cayman was 1962. You know what I mean? There, how Bermuda is, and I can tell you, I've worked there and I've visited there a lot for different places. It's a different mindset. We are different, we're unique, and I think we need to find something that is unique in that thing there. But I am uncomfortable, extremely uncomfortable, putting a law on our books that this legislature or future legislators may not be able to change. Because this is clearly a Section 801 issue, well, a Section 55 issue that the governor can change using Section 801. And as we can see, they don't play around in terms of using that Section 801. And just 2 years ago, Mr. Speaker, is when Bermuda removed conscription from their law. I mean, what's to stop some governor, future governor, from putting it back into our law? Because they can go in and just change these bills as it stands. I mean, look at the domestic partnership bill. It came as domestic partnership, and 2-2 became civil partnership. So I encourage the members of this House to see if we can find a way to rename this bill and not make it an automatic Section 55 issue, but basically give the Premier and his government a lot more to do with regards to where this bill needs to go. This kind of power vested in any one individual is immoral, it's wrong, and it's undemocratic. Modern democratic principles require civilian oversight of military personnel. This bill has none, and as such, it has no place in any developed country or in the Cayman Islands. The treatment of the Windrush generation shows what the UK government thinks of people from the Caribbean that helped them fight World War II and also to rebuild after World War II. The treatment or lack of treatment by the UK government to the Cayman Islands and other overseas territories in times of crisis shows what they think of us. The UK has a constitutional responsibility to help us, and as the retired general said, they can't even help themselves. If we are now paying for and providing for our own defense, then I must ask the question, what purpose the UK serve? So, Mr. Speaker, we're facing many other challenges, and I'm still trying. No, Mr. Premier, you're not going to pull me out like that. So, Mr. Speaker, we're faced with many other challenges, and I'm still trying to find out the question that this bill is trying to answer. Does it answer the question of people that are struggling to make ends meet? Does it answer the question of people that are worried about their jobs, their livelihood, and their income? Does it answer the question of people that are worried about their children's education and future opportunities? Does it answer the question of people that are worried about their health care and the cost of health care? Does it answer the question that people are worried about their pensions that some of them still can't get? I really hope that we realize now how flawed our current pension system is, and that we seriously need to fix it. Mr. Speaker, the last verse of Amazing Grace ends, when we have been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we have no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. Mr. Speaker, if I live for 10,000 years, I would not entrust the lives of my children to this governor or any other governor, and as such, I will not vote to entrust the lives of any other children to him or his successors. The bill as presented in its current form does not have my support. And unless I see where there is more control by the Premier, who I have more faith in his abilities, because I can tell you right now, Mr. Speaker, the UK itself is in a disaster for their own management. They need to be sending people down here to come learn from us and to come learn from our government. They're getting ready to be in lockdown, and when I walk around and I see, oh, we have some level of normalcy because of the decisions that were made, that we were able to at least improve the quality of people's lives in this condition. And give Jack his jacket. I mean, and as I said earlier, that the Premier has to accept some responsibility for me having this position, because he has shown me that he's far more capable than many of the other leaders of the developed countries. And I would prefer, at the end of the day, somebody who knows my family, knows other people's family, knows their kids and everybody else, to be entrusted with this level of power. But this type of colonial bill in 2020 that vests all of this power into one man with no civilian oversight or no oversight, I don't even know what the Defense Board does. Nothing. Can't work. So unless the Premier and we in this honorable House can find a way to give the elected government more say and have some level of civilian oversight, I can't vote for this bill. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I thank you all, and God bless you all.
Does any other member wish to speak? The Honorable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I shall be brief. Mr. Speaker, thank you. I, Mr. Speaker, have always loved the army life. Surprising to some. And having been turned on to this idea, Mr. Speaker, from a very young boy, from our Presbyterian United Church, Boys Brigade, and those principles that were ingrained in me in this interdenominational organization founded by Sir William Alexander Smith, gave me some good principles and training I still remember from some 45 years ago. And the motto and the emblem of the Boys Brigade, the emblem in itself is sure and steadfast, and the motto itself is the motto of the Boys Brigade is the advancement of Christ's kingdom amongst boys and the promotion of habits, obedience, reverence, discipline, self-respect, and all that tends towards a true Christian manliness. Still remember it, Mr. Speaker. The training that these young women and men of the regiment will be afforded at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst in England, that was established to promote the improved understanding and leadership beyond the academy one of the top academies in the world. This leadership training will live on forever. I believe from what I heard, I believe the governor had good intent. And yes, it is our job as legislators to ensure we debate and hash out bills to ensure it doesn't just work for this government, but for the good of all the Cayman Islands and for all governments to come. I must admit, Mr. Speaker, in listening intently, that there has been some good debate and contribution. Hence the reason for the Honorable Premier, who has already rose to his feet and said, we have heard and appreciate some of the members' contributions who spoke thus far, and we have undertook to take them on board and make amendments. I must add, Mr. Speaker, that if the people of this country ever decides, and I say the people, that we should go independent, it will be important that we have a structure that is not far from ready to take on a new role to defend this country, in my opinion. Many years ago, when the former Honorable Minister Borden helped form what is the Cadet Corps, I was so happy about that and thought that these cadets could have filled the jobs at the uniformed branches of this country and would even form part of what we are trying to do right now. I can confess, as a teenager, Mr. Speaker, me and my friend Jerry made serious attempts to join the U.S. Army through our families in the U.S. But it did not mature, did not work out. Thankfully so. So I've always had a passion for this type of service, Mr. Speaker, and it must be encouraged. I have not heard one debate today, Mr. Speaker, that didn't support the concept of a regiment. And I'm very encouraged by this. And even though I'm supportive of this bill, with the amendments, I agree we have to get it right for the good of Cayman and its people. It's so exciting to see so many Caymanians come up to me, Mr. Speaker, asking questions about the regiment and physically and mentally preparing for the training. I had one guy who came up to me, say he had stopped drinking. He had a special diet now. He had joined the gym. He was running 5 miles a day just to be ready for this training. That made me so proud, Mr. Speaker. So the effects that has had on our young Caymanians looking for this opportunity to serve in this nature, I am very motivated. And for that, I am happy to support this bill with the amendments that are coming. Mr. Speaker, in wrapping up, as I said, not a long presentation. Many members have spoke already. I was very proud when the Bermuda Regiment came here after Hurricane Ivan and assisted us in Cayman. For those reasons and seeing the way that that regiment assisted us here in Cayman, I think we too can benefit from having a regiment. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the Premier and the Attorney General in their wrap-ups will make us aware of any or all the amendments that will be coming forward and taking on board contributions from the debate. I thank you, and God bless.
If no other member wishes to speak, then I'll call on the Honorable Premier to wind up his right of reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to begin by thanking all members of this Honorable House for their contributions, and for those, every member of the opposition spoke, and for those on this side of the House who did not speak, for their tacit support in these proceedings. This bill has been the subject of much discussion within our caucus and within the cabinet. The concept of the regiment is one that we have explored and pursued for 2 years. And, Mr. Speaker, while I did discern, I believe, that there are some members in the opposition who actually support what we are trying to do and made earnest contributions in the sense that they analyzed and criticized provisions in the bill which they felt were incongruous, not in keeping with the overall objective, and in some instances they did quite correctly point out areas where they felt that there was overreach and the potential for decision making by the governor, whoever he or she may be, with respect to the deployment of the regiment. We take those on board. I am going to go through in some detail what we are prepared at the stage to propose with respect to committee stage amendments. We've had discussions with His Excellency the Governor and his office, and indeed he has had discussions with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office about some of these concerns. Mr. Speaker, members are correct in noting that the draft, the template of the bill was the Bermuda Regiment Act. That's, I don't think is the correct name, but the act which has established the Bermuda Regiment some 55 years ago. And, Mr. Speaker, that's where we started, because that is the preeminent regiment within the overseas territories, and it is also the oldest of them. Mr. Speaker, no one should question, especially no member in this House, should question my views on the importance of the elected members in this country, insofar as that is at all possible determining what happens here. The 8th of next month will be 20 years since I was first elected, and I've devoted many of those years to advancing Cayman's constitutional status, even in the face of opposition from members who are no longer here, and indeed in the face of opposition from members who are currently on the opposition bench. So, no one should question where I stand in terms of that particular issue. But I also know, Mr. Speaker, that if we don't respect the Constitution that we have, we really can't expect anybody else to. Defense is a special responsibility of the governor under Section 55(1) of the Constitution. It is one of those areas that is within his exclusive, or that office's exclusive province. Mr. Speaker, so is responsibility for national security or internal security as it is described in the Constitution. And no member in this House questions, that I know, the governor's ability to make decisions all by himself or herself, as the case may be, with respect to the police service. The governor has 4 areas of special responsibility: defense, external affairs, and internal security, including the police, and generally speaking, the public service. Mr. Speaker, we have managed over the years to make certain incursions, if I may call them that, into that overriding power. We've managed to get the UK to agree to the establishment of a National Security Council, which does give some significant degree of involvement in national security affairs. The governor and the previous governor as well have agreed to delegate to myself the responsibility for managing the financial aspects of involving the Royal Cayman Islands Police Service in this House. But none of that, Mr. Speaker, detracts from the reality that the governor ultimately has responsibility for these areas. Mr. Speaker, what is becoming clearer and clearer is that the opposition, the official opposition, let me be clear, the official opposition seem to be developing a clarion call for a move to independence. I hope they are brave enough to put this in their manifesto. Mr. Speaker, the member from Savannah was very clear in his statement in that regard.
Honorable Premier,
Oh, I'm sorry.
are you willing to give way?
Only if I know what the member is standing for.
Yes.
He may want to drink or something.
Honorable Deputy Leader of the
It
Opposition.
depends how the Premier explains what he's saying. Is that his opinion, or is he stating a fact? Because nobody over here has advocated for independence. Not one soul has advocated or said the word that we need to go independent.
Premier, I take that as a point of clarification.
Mr. Speaker, I sat here and listened. So, but I'm not going to argue about that. I've had enough messages on my phone, and I see it in the Caymanian compass as well. So it's not only me who has interpreted what has been said in here in that way. But there'll be time enough for that. But Mr. Speaker, my point is, as I've said more than once, I've said it publicly, I am not one of those who thinks the end of the world will occur if Cayman does someday become independent. I've said over and over again, we are not, in my view, anywhere near ready for that. And that while I view independence in the way I view my death, in that they are both inevitable, I hope neither of them happens soon. So if the opposition is of the view that it needs to be fast forwarded, then that's entirely up to them. That's a proper political platform, and the people can vote and determine whether
Mr. Speaker,
or not.
point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable Premier, the member for Bontown West.
No, I just want the Premier, just to remind the Premier, it was him who said in the UK, because I was there when he said it, when he told them that they tried to push certain things in Cayman, that Cayman people may not take it too well, and his words were along the lines, independence like my death is inevitable, but I hope neither come soon. So the conversation of independence, I first heard the words out of him, and he inspired me.
I take it for the point of clarification.
That's fine, Mr. Speaker. As I say, I just hope they're brave enough to put it in their manifesto, that's all. Thank you. Good. So, Mr. Speaker, the point of my going into this is that many of the things that members on that side have continually, not just in the context of this particular debate, but in debate in recent times, called for, advocated for, require, essentially, that you divest the governor of various responsibilities and authority to do various things. Now, Mr. Speaker, I don't think that all of that is necessarily bad. That has been above everything else I've done, I have given more time to that pursuit, not for independence, but of control, more control of the destiny of this country and our people. I've given more time and effort to that than any other single item I have dealt with in my nearly 20 years here. So I'm not, for members to get up and suggest that somehow I and the government I have the honor and privilege to lead are introducing some colonial piece of legislation unfitting in this day and time, and et cetera, is, Mr. Speaker, I don't know, at best incongruous, but certainly, Mr. Speaker, not sincere. They can't do that sincerely, knowing me the way that all of them know me, and knowing of my record of advocacy for constitutional advancement all my political career. I am hopeful, Mr. Speaker, I hope, Mr. Speaker, that the last major effort on my part and the part of my government, with in particular the assistance of the member from Northside, and indeed, Mr. Speaker, the member from Newlands, I hope and pray that that does culminate on the 11th of next month in the UK agreeing to amendments to the Constitution which will make clear beyond doubt that the Cabinet of the Cayman Islands has full autonomy with respect to all domestic matters. There are a number of other changes, but that is the key thing. Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to go into the Section 801 stuff again, which I will always deeply regret. I'm not trying to be provocative or to beat up on anybody. I am hopeful still that when I am through with this, members on the other side will feel sufficiently content that they will support the Cayman Islands Regiment, because this bill will underpin that regiment and the dreams and aspirations and opportunities it will create for thousands of Caymanians in due course. Mr. Speaker, as I said, a significant number of very good points have been made by members on the other side, notably the speech by the member from Northside was very, very helpful and allowed us, Mr. Speaker, to go back to the governor, his office, and the FCO with a good case for why there needed to be a yielding of authority in the bill to the elected premier, and in at least one instance the leader of the opposition as well, and that when it comes to issues involving the employment of the Cayman Regiment, that it could not be a case of the governor simply making those decisions all on his or her own. Mr. Speaker, I'll come to all of that, but I want to address one of the major inaccuracies that has been raised, that somehow the men and women who have enlisted in the regiment to date were not aware of what they were committing to. Mr. Speaker, it is a fact that all of the enlisted men and women were presented with documents to sign that very much mirror many of the provisions set out in the bill with respect to training requirements, service inside and potentially outside of the islands, as well as details of what constitutes military offenses. Mr. Speaker, I have copies of those documents here, and before I sit down, I will like to lay them on the table of the House so they are part of the public record. Mr. Speaker, it is perhaps understandable that some members in this House are uncomfortable with the provision for discipline for military offenses, and more specifically, the punishment of imprisonment, possible imprisonment for members of the regiment as outlined in clauses 45 and 46. However, Mr. Speaker, the Cayman Islands Regiment is not an arm of the Cayman Islands Boy Scouts or the Girls Brigade. It is a disciplined military force, and in the case of such an entity, you would expect disciplined service and imprisonment in being possible last resort punishments for offenses. Mr. Speaker, when we have to deal with bad events and disastrous events which cause the average person to run away, those are the times when the men and women of our regiment will be expected to run towards the events, rendering assistance and bringing relief. Mr. Speaker, it was proposed by some members on the other side that the Commissioner of Police could replace the regiment's commanding officer. While both the Royal Cayman Islands Police Service and the Cayman Islands Regiment deliver aid to these islands, the Royal Cayman Islands Police Service is a national police service with a unified command structure. It is an unarmed service. Generally, there's only a small unit that is trained to respond with firearms. And it is mandated by statute to deliver the full range of police services across the Cayman Islands. Everything from traffic, dealing with traffic, to dealing with murders and complex fraud cases. Mr. Speaker, on the other hand, the role of the Cayman Islands Regiment, which is set out in the bill, is for the defense of the Cayman Islands, the provision of humanitarian assistance, and disaster relief. And the regiment can also be called upon to assist the police service and the Cayman Islands Coast Guard in appropriate and necessary cases. Mr. Speaker, there was also an allegation that members of the regiment have not been trained in disaster relief and delivering humanitarian response. Mr. Speaker, that could not be more incorrect. All members of the regiment have already undergone basic military training, specific training with humanitarian assistance and with disaster relief. The Cayman Islands Regiment has already participated in 2 day-long disaster response training exercises along with Hazard Management Cayman Islands and the Red Cross. The members of the regiment are receiving advanced first aid training and water rescue training. Within the existing ranks of the regiments, there is a lieutenant who is a trained emergency responder instructor, a first aid instructor, and a trained combat medic. Well placed, Mr. Speaker, I believe, to train and develop capabilities within the regiment. Mr. Speaker, it was mentioned, I believe, by the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, the member from Newlands, that the governor could direct the prosecution of persons inside and outside of the regiment. Mr. Speaker, that is not so. Section 57 of the Cayman Islands Constitution is clear that the Director of Public Prosecutions is independent and can take over and continue any criminal proceedings that have been instituted by any other person or authority. I need to make clear, Mr. Speaker, that governor or no governor, premier or no premier, attorney general or no attorney general, the Director of Public Prosecutions is not subject to direction or instruction by any one, by any office. It's a completely independent office. And the Director of Prosecution, Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to give way. I'm trying to finish the point.
I'm trying to be helpful too, Mr. Speaker.
No, I'm not going to give away, Mr. Speaker.
He's not giving away at this point.
Well, on a point of order then, I
Yes,
think the Premier
but
is,
what point of order?
I think the Premier is misrepresenting what I said in my debate. Because it clearly
Misrepresentation.
says in clause 51, and I'll read it again, criminal proceedings in respect of an offense against this law shall not, without the written consent of the Director of the Public Prosecutions, be instituted by any person other than the governor or by an officer or other person duly authorized by the governor in that behalf. Now, I agree with him what the Constitution says, but this law says something different.
It doesn't.
And that was, yes, it does. It says that the governor doesn't, that means the governor does not have to seek the permission of the
Not so.
the DPP.
Not so.
Well, maybe
Mr.
the
Speaker,
Attorney General,
this-
the Honorable
this-
Attorney General
this-
could clear this up for us, Mr. Speaker, because if it is cleared up, then I'm fine.
Okay, you have made your point. Honorable Premier, can you continue?
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the member knows that no piece of legislation, of primary legislation, passed by this House can supersede what is in the Constitution. Even if there were a conflict, which there is not, the Constitution would, I can't even use that word, the Constitution would be the superior law.
Honorable Premier, I don't want to stop you, but do you see yourself going beyond 5 minutes more, or?
Yes, Mr.
You will?
Speaker, considerably beyond that, sir.
Well, Honorable Premier, I'll give you some time to collect your thoughts. I need to suspend for 5 minutes and ask members to stay in their seats.
Wait.
5 minutes. Yes, I was going to do that on my way back in, but Premier, can you please? We have reached that hour. The hour 4:30.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the suspension of Standing Order 10-2 in order that the business of the House may continue beyond the hour of interruption.
Question is that standing orders be suspended. Standing Order 10-2 be suspended in order for the House to continue after the hour of 4:30 p.m. All in favor? Aye. Those against? Ayes have it. I will take a 5-minute suspension. No, didn't say that. the Premier continuing.
Mr. Speaker, they don't listen, sir. They don't listen to me either. I should wrap up in half an hour. Mr. Speaker, when I was interrupted, I was making the point that the suggestion which he insisted on emphasizing when he stood, made by the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, that the Governor could direct the prosecution of persons inside and outside the regiment, is not the case. Mr. Speaker, Section 57 of the Cayman Islands Constitution is clear that the Director of Public Prosecutions is independent and can take over and continue any criminal proceedings that have been instituted by any other person or authority. Mr. Speaker, to make it absolutely beyond doubt, with your permission, I would refer the Honorable House to Section 57, subsection 4 of the Constitution, which says, the powers conferred on the Director of Public Prosecutions by subsection 2B and C shall be vested in him or her to the exclusion of any other person or authority. And then it goes on, Mr. Speaker, but that is the point. The Director of Public Prosecutions is independent and does not take instructions from anyone. Mr. Speaker, what Section 51, Clause 51 of the bill says, 51.1, criminal proceedings in respect of an offense against this law shall not, without the written consent of the Director of Public Prosecutions, be instituted by any person other than the Governor or by an officer or other person duly authorized by the Governor in that behalf. That's not saying that the Governor can override the Director of Public Prosecutions. The point of that section, clause, Mr. Speaker, is that other persons, in the normal course of events, if there were not such a provision in the law, any private person can begin a prosecution against another person. And what this clause is seeking to do is to prevent civilians, essentially, from bringing prosecutions against members of the regiment. The only office that is allowed to do so is the Governor's office, and the Governor can delegate people to do so. But at any point, regardless of whether the Governor does so or not, the Director of Public Prosecutions is entitled, pursuant to the Constitution, to decide to take over those that prosecution or to discontinue it. Ultimate control for prosecutions is the sole responsibility of the Director of Public Prosecutions. And to suggest otherwise, as the Deputy Leader of the Opposition has done, is mischievous and simply done, in my view, Mr. Speaker, to create further alarm and concern about a bill and a regiment that he does not support. Mr. Speaker, that is a travesty. There are currently hundreds of Caymanians who welcome and want to embrace, some have embraced the opportunity to serve their country, and to deliberately go about saying things in this House to discourage them, despite the protestations otherwise, is just wrong, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think the Deputy Governor has already addressed the allegation made by the member from Northside. Well, maybe it's not an allegation. He said he had heard that weapons, what do you call that? A consignment of weapons had already arrived for the Cayman Islands Regiment. Mr. Speaker, that is not so. Although members of the regiment have undergone training in weapons systems, weapons systems training is a component of basic training that all who enlist in the regiment must complete. Mr. Speaker, I have been surprised, to put it mildly, that members in this House, not all members, some members in this House, on the other side, would not want Caymanians who, for most of our existence, since these islands were settled following the Treaty of Madrid in 1657, have had to defend ourselves most of the time, certainly had to eke out a living and survive without other assistance. The children and grandchildren of Caymanians who served in the Home Guard and the Trinidad Naval Reserve would find it offensive and dangerous for us to create a regiment capable of defending this soil. Mr. Speaker, that generation who went before must be turning in their graves to hear their children and grandchildren say, our own people are not up to defending this soil, when they got on boats and went all over the world to defend not just this little rock or these three little rocks in the Caribbean Sea, but to aid in the effort, Mr. Speaker, by the mother country and her allies to save the world from Hitler. And even the war before that, Caymanians went and fought. And now we are saying our own people are not up to defending this soil, and they want independence. Mr. Speaker, I have only been able to reconcile some of the statements I've heard from members on the other side by putting it down to sheer politics and the proximity of the impending elections. I can't otherwise reconcile it. Mr. Speaker, we can't get up here in this House time and time again and bang on about the UK won't give us, the UK is encroaching on us doing this, won't allow us to do this. We are nation builders. And then when you are presented with a golden opportunity to say, yes, I want my people to be able to wear the uniform of the Cayman Islands Regiment, to walk proudly, and to be capable of helping us look after ourselves in any contingency. You say, no, 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 no. We can't do that because we think the governor gonna have too much power. Well, how much power does he have now without this bill? We have nothing besides the Royal Cayman Islands Police Service and the other uniformed services to help us in the case of any exigency. Who controls them? But His Excellency the Governor, under the same Section 55. There is nothing in principle different between the control which the Governor has over the Royal Cayman Islands Police Service, over the civil service, than that he will have, or she, as the case may be, over the Cayman Islands Regiment. Because this Constitution sets out the 4 special responsibilities of the Governor. The first one is defense. The second one is internal security. The third one is, let me not misquote, external affairs. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Leader of the Opposition. And the next is the public service. The Leader of the Opposition knows it well, Mr. Speaker, which is why some of the things he said is even more, or are even more mischievous, because he knows better.
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order, the Premier...
Remember, the Honorable Leader of the Opposition,
the Premier is...
do you have a point of order?
Yes, my point of order is that the Premier is now misleading. Everything he has talked about the we should be proud to see our young Caymanians in the uniform. Mr. Speaker, that's what I said when I was debating this bill. I said I am proud of it if 500 join it. And I had nothing against it. I had concerns with some of the provisions in the bill. And the bill, thus far, he has presented some of them to change them. So why is he now saying that I'm being mischievous when he's agreeing with everything that I said, that I support the regiment, that I supported it from day one? You know, the Premier really mischievous? Maybe that word should be turned on him, because all he's doing is repeating what I said about how proud I was to be able to be a part of creating one. Now he's saying I'm being mischievous. That's not right. He needs to correct that now.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful.
Honorable the Premier.
I'm grateful to the Honorable Leader of the Opposition for clarifying that, and I'm sorry that I misinterpreted what he said. But I am most grateful for his confirmation that, subject to those changes that I propose being made, he will support the bill.
I never said any such thing. Mr. Speaker, I didn't say any such thing. I said he has now even brought some changes as a result of the things that we said from over here, including myself, that I had concerns about. I never said any such thing. See, he does it every time, and you talk about mischievous, you're like a little 4-year-old man.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that the public is as confused as I am now. Is he going to support the bill or not? But we'll see. Mr. Speaker, the other point I want to address is the contention by the member from Georgetown Central that this is retroactive legislation. Mr. Speaker, it is most definitely not. The program to establish the regiment had the approval of the cabinet, as did the supplementary funding which was appropriated by the cabinet to enable the regiment to be established. Mr. Speaker, I need to make this point, I think, carefully, because I've heard it bandied about on various talk shows in particular, and I heard it from one member on the other side in their debate, that the establishment of the regiment was illegal. Mr. Speaker, let me make this clear. Prescriptive legislation. I'm glad you agree, Mr. Leader. Mr. Speaker, prescriptive legislation is not required to set up a public entity and bring recruitment, planning, training, and work necessary to fully establish the same. I gave the example of the Coast Guard, which has been in operation now for about 2 years, and we are still grappling with the appropriate legislation to underpin that. I don't hear anybody anywhere complaining that the Coast Guard is illegal, even though the ultimate responsibility for the Coast Guard lies with the governor under the same Section 55, this time with respect to his special responsibility for internal security. The regiment and the Royal Cayman Islands Police Service are brothers or sisters, whatever you want to call it, in that respect. They have the same office holding ultimate responsibility for them, the governor's office. The sections of the bill, or the clauses of the bill, that were referred to by the member from Georgetown Central as being retroactive are instead, Mr. Speaker, what are called transitional provisions, a commonly used legitimate form of drafting that has been used in many bills in this legislative assembly. Mr. Speaker, the one that has been probably used most in recent times that members here would have known about would be the immigration. That's actually even called the Immigration Transition Bill. Mr. Speaker, the Customs and Border Control Law passed by this Honorable House in December of 2018 also contains provisions for transitioning, including a provision for formally recognizing persons hired prior to that law coming into force. Mr. Speaker, all members that were in this honorable chamber on the 21st of November 2018 supported the Customs and Border Control Bill. No member voted against the bill. And as I said, that bill contained a range of transitional provisions. Mr. Speaker, for completion, or for completeness, I would give the example of Section 136 of the Customs and Border Control Law, which provides a person who is appointed or purported to be appointed prior to the date of the commencement of this law as a public officer of the Customs and Border Control shall be deemed on that date to have been lawfully appointed and shall continue to be appointed under this law, subject to the Public Service Management Law. A person who is appointed or purported to be appointed prior to the date of the commencement of this law to the post of director shall be deemed on that date to have been lawfully appointed and shall continue to be appointed under this law, subject to the Public Service Management Law. Mr. Speaker, I am grateful to members on the other side, in particular the member from Bordentown West, for his his very complimentary remarks about myself, my stewardship of this office. Even though, Mr. Speaker, he juxtaposed that against, or I should say, maybe I shouldn't use juxtapose, he used that as the basis for his argument that I should be given full responsibility for the regiment. And Mr. Speaker, were it within the constitutional provisions, I would welcome that. But I have learned, Mr. Speaker, as I'm sure he will, because he's a very bright man. When he's been here 20 years, he will learn that sometimes it is far more useful to your people and to your country to negotiate than to fight. It is the result that matters for your people. And so, Mr. Speaker, if we believe, as I believe every member of this House does, that the establishment of a regiment of our own people to assist in our defense, to assist with humanitarian services in the event of a disaster of any kind, is something worthy of embracing, then I believe we should all work to find a way to make that happen. And Mr. Leader, I am a man full of optimism and hope. And I continue to be optimistic and hopeful that I will persuade you all, grudgingly or otherwise, to support the bill.
Yeah, and you would love to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory too.
Well, I hope I don't succeed in that today. But, Mr. Speaker, as long as there is a constitutional provision where responsibility for defense remains within the exclusive purview of the governor, until we get that changed, and I don't think I'm going to be here long enough to succeed in that regard. Those who are leading the independence charge may succeed in that regard. But we have, we have, Mr. Speaker, to try to find ways, Mr. Speaker, of making this work for us. Now, Mr. Speaker, as I said, there were a number of very useful and appropriate suggestions made, criticisms made of the bill. Mr. Speaker, I handed out the draft bill to members while the member from Newlands was speaking. I noticed, though, Mr. Speaker, that there was no reference whatsoever, even though we had a luncheon break intervening, by either him or the member from Bordentown West of anything that was said.
No, Mr. Speaker, point of order, that is incorrect.
But, Mr. Speaker,
Honourable member, you're rising on
Point of order.
which point of order?
The Premier is misleading the House because I raised a concern and I said I am happy to see that the Premier addressed it in his committee stage amendment. I did say that because I prepared my speech based on what was presented to the public, and that's what I debated, but I still went through and I made note of it. And I said I was grateful that he did, so no misleading, more than once too, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, if he did, I missed it, and I apologize. I apologize, Mr. Speaker. But Mr. Speaker, that is helpful and hopeful that if these proposed changes are satisfactory, the member from Bordentown West will support the bill. So, Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I would like to mention what is being proposed by way of changes, in the hope, Mr. Speaker, that members may be persuaded. Mr. Speaker, members objected to Clause 3 relating to military service to be performed in and outside of the islands. The current clause says a member of the regiment may be required to perform military services, including training and non-combatant services, both in and outside islands at the direction of the governor. Mr. Speaker, we've listened to the arguments against that, and what, Mr. Speaker, I will propose is that we delete the words "at the direction of the governor" and substitute for it "in accordance with this law." And, Mr. Speaker, further proposed amendments to other clauses in the law, I think, should go a long way to address the legitimate concern of members on the other side about the deployment of our people overseas. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to try to go through this clause by clause so members can follow. Mr. Speaker, Clause 9, and I think this concern was raised certainly most by the member from Northside, and I'm grateful to him for his suggestions about the Defense Board, because it's a long clause, Mr. Speaker, 9 clauses in it, 9 subclauses in it, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but the main concern that I discerned was that the governor essentially had full control of the board, extending indeed to even being able to take over the chair of the board where he saw fit. So, Mr. Speaker, we are proposing that we delete the first subclause, which said the governor shall by notice appoint annually a board called the Defense Board, which shall consist of such number of persons not being not less than 5 nor more than 11, as the governor may determine, and such notice shall be published in the Gazette. The other point that the member from Northside raised there was there is this huge discretion between 5 and 11, and that the governor could possibly stack the board in his favor if he thought decisions were being made that he didn't agree with. Mr. Speaker, what we are going to propose is to delete that subclause and substitute the following. The governor shall by notice appoint annually a board called the Defense Board, which shall comprise 7 members, 2 of them appointed on the advice of the Premier, and 1 on the advice of the Leader of the Opposition. So, Mr. Speaker, it's not just the governor making the appointments. Mr. Speaker, there was also concern expressed by the same member about the length of the term that members of the board could serve. That is subclause 2. A person appointed to be a member of the board shall hold office during the governor's pleasure, which means as long as the governor wants, and unless the person's appointment is earlier terminated, it shall be deemed to terminate 1 year from the date upon which the appointment took effect. We are proposing to delete that and to substitute, therefore, the following. A person appointed to be a member of the board shall hold office for a term of 3 years and shall be eligible for reappointment. Mr. Speaker, there was also concern expressed about the way voting would occur, and Clause 9, Subclause 6 currently reads, at every meeting of the board, a quorum shall consist of a simple majority of members present, and decision shall be adopted by a simple majority of the votes of the members present and voting, except that in the case of an equality of votes, the chairperson of the meeting shall in addition have a casting vote. We're changing it, Mr. Speaker, so that it will read, at every meeting of the board, a quorum shall consist of 4 members, and decisions shall be adopted by a simple majority of the vote of the members present and voting, except that in the case of inequality of votes, the chairperson shall, in addition, have a casting vote. That is to reflect, Mr. Speaker, the reduction in the number of members, or the possible number of members. Mr. Speaker, concerns were also raised again by the member from Northside with respect to clause 14, which seven. Sorry, Mr. Speaker, I just want to clear up a point for the Leader of the Opposition. The overall number of members of the board will be 7, of which. So this is the proposed amendment, Mr. Leader. So the number will be fixed at 7, 2 to be appointed by the Premier, 1 by the Leader of the Opposition, and the other 4 by the Governor. So, Mr. Speaker, clause 14 deals with the enlistment and period of service. Mr. Speaker, the concern expressed by the member from Northside was that the enlistment was limited to Commonwealth or Irish citizens, or British overseas territory citizens, or British citizens. And his point, which we've taken on board, is the makeup of these islands. There are 129, 130 different nationalities here, and since enlistment is open to persons who are permanent residents, as well as Caymanians, we would not perhaps want to be so restrictive. And so the proposal is to delete subclause 14, subclause 1, and substitute the following. Subject to directions of the Governor and Section 15, a person who is 18 years of age or no more than 50 years of age, I think that's age discrimination too, maybe we should look at that, and who is either a Caymanian or a permanent resident within the meaning of the Immigration Transition Law 2018 may be enlisted into the regiment in such manner and subject to such conditions as are provided under this law and as prescribed. So there is no restriction on what their nationality can be as long as they are a permanent resident. There are none. There are none. Mr. Speaker, there was a long discussion by one of the members, I think it was the member from Newlands, about work permit holders. Mr. Speaker, work permit holders are not entitled to be enlisted. I don't remember which member it was, but yeah, but this doesn't say that. It says permanent resident. Mr. Speaker, there will be, I hear some other suggestions there, Mr. Speaker. We'll have the opportunity in committee stage to make further adjustments to the bill if that's what members overall feel. No, there's none. Mr. Speaker, Yes, he does. Mr. Speaker, clause, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Leader, we can talk about those in committee stage. Mr. Speaker, clause 14.
Honorable members, please, there's a lot of crosstalk, and I sometimes really can't hear the Premier.
Sometimes the Premier can't hear himself. Mr. Speaker, clause 14B. In subclause 3, Mr. Speaker, this was one of the areas that was complained about. Clause 14(1)B, subclause 3. Mr. Speaker, this is with respect to, again, enlistment and period of service. Said, Mr. Speaker, the governor may consult the Premier and may, in the governor's discretion, allow persons not meeting the requirements of subsection 1 to be enlisted into the regiment if the governor considers this to be in the best interest of the regiment. Mr. Speaker, we are proposing that to delete the words "in the governor's discretion." Mr. Speaker, subclause 20, not subclause, clause 28, Mr. Speaker, was another area that was heavily criticized, and indeed, for good cause, I concede. Mr. Speaker, this is regarding the embodiment, what's called the embodiment of the regiment. Section 28, Mr. Speaker, currently reads, subclause 1, if the governor considers it necessary to do so, A, in the interest of public safety, B, for the defense of the islands, C, to assist with public safety in another British overseas territory or foreign state, or D, for any other reason as the governor sees fit, the governor may, by order published in the Gazette or otherwise made known to members of the regiment in such manner as may seem to the governor best suited to the circumstances, direct that the regiment or any part of the regiment be embodied. And then 28, subclause 2, Mr. Speaker, the governor shall consult with the Premier before making an order under subsection 1 unless the governor considers this impractical. Mr. Speaker, we are proposing that the words "unless the governor considers this impractical" be deleted. And Mr. Speaker, subclause 3, the governor shall seek the agreement of the Premier before embodying the regiment for a deployment to a foreign state, but agreement is not required for deployment within the islands or to another British overseas territory. We are proposing deleting that subclause, Mr. Speaker, and substituting it with the following. The governor shall obtain the agreement of the Premier before embodying the regiment for a deployment to a foreign state or to another British overseas territory, but agreement is not required for deployment within the islands. Mr. Speaker, the reason why agreement is not necessary constitutionally is because defense of the territory is a matter for the governor on his special responsibilities. But I made the case that it is hard to conceive of a situation whereby the deployment of the regiment overseas could possibly be in the defense of the territory, and therefore the governor's constitutional remit would not allow him to do that without the agreement of the Premier, because his special responsibilities relate to the territory, this territory, not any other territory or foreign state. No. Mr. Speaker, Clause 63. Which are the transitional provisions. I don't know that there was particular complaint about those, but those have been picked up as needing amendment in our review. These are the transitional provisions. Section 6, Clause 63, Subclause 1. Hey. Just a moment, Mr. Speaker. The AG is checking something for me. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for that indulgence. Mr. Speaker, in subclause 1, 63 subclause 1, currently reads, a person who is appointed or purported to be appointed to any position in the regiment by the governor prior to the date of the commencement of this law shall be deemed on that date to have been lawfully appointed by the governor. We are proposing to delete the words to have been lawfully appointed by the governor and simply substituting the words to have been appointed by the governor under this law. Mr. Speaker, those are the draft amendments that I have previously circulated to members. I emphasize that they are draft and have been already subject to some changes since I circulated them just before lunch. But they are,
Mr. Speaker,
The member for Georgetown Central, are you rising on a point of order?
a matter of clarity, if the Premier would give way.
Okay, honorable member, the Premier has given way.
Mr. Speaker, while I was attending the lunchroom just a minute ago, I overheard the Premier saying that, we were making accusation that it wasn't lawful.
No.
But then we made the amendment to take out the word lawful in respect to the transitional provisions. So if I was incorrect, or I didn't make the assumption that the law was incorrect in its drafting by using the word lawfully appointed, because they've now withdrawn it. Am I misunderstanding that, or could he explain what's the purpose of the withdrawing of the lawful part now?
do you want to hear this, man? I really don't understand the distinction, honestly. I don't understand something I explain it, but if I don't understand it, I never try. Mr. Speaker, the member from Georgetown Central has raised a legal point, which honestly I am not able to respond to. So we can leave it until we get to committee stage, or with your indulgence and indulgence of the House, the AG can perhaps explain.
Honorable Premier, I think that, in fact, I think that many of these could be left until committee stage.
That's fine, sir. Fine with me. I just don't want to
Mr. Speaker,
not try and answer.
Mr. Speaker, I would just say I thank the Premier and we can deal with it in committee stage.
Premier continuing.
Mr. Speaker, while I was on my feet, I was handed another set of proposed changes, which I have in my usual way misplaced while I'm speaking. If I could have a moment to try to recover them. Perhaps you might want to take the evening break. I'm very close to winding up, sir, but it is important that I apprise members before they vote of these other proposed changes. I'm in your hands, Mr. Speaker. We can either take a very short break that I can recover them, or we could take the evening break. Now, I am open to either.
Honorable members, we should take then the break until 5:15?
6.
Until 6?
It's 5. It's 5:10.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's enough time. Half an hour.
The House shall suspend until 6 p.m. 6 p.m.